It was a weekend afternoon at Denver International Airport, filled with the sounds of people and announcements. Suitcase wheels clattered across the polished marble floors, reflecting the brilliant light from the ceiling. In the midst of the crowd, Federal Judge Arthur Sterling had just stepped out of the business-class cabin of a flight from Washington, D.C. He was 60 years old, but he was still tall, his demeanor as calm and dignified as in a courtroom. His charcoal gray suit was perfectly tailored, unwrinkled, his white shirt was crisp, his dark blue silk tie was neatly tied, and his black Oxford shoes were shiny as if they had just been polished. In his hand, he carried a black alligator briefcase, a luxury that was as understated as he was. His gaze was sharp and calm, scanning the scene around him, a professional habit after many years on the bench. Little did he know that in a few minutes, his honor, his dignity, and his heart would be brutally tested. A group of security guards approached. No explanation. No questions. Just cold orders and impatient looks. His hands were pulled behind his back. The sound of handcuffs echoed through the bustling space, like a slap to the dignity. Hundreds of eyes turned to him. Curious, scrutinizing looks, then turned to contempt. No one knew who he was. No one cared. They just saw a black man, dressed in fine clothes, handcuffed like a drug dealer who had just been caught red-handed. And they were satisfied, a strange joy in seeing the rich fall. Inside him was a tidal wave, humiliation, anger, and a sense of betrayal by the very system he served. But he held back. Not out of fear. Because he knew, real power does not scream. It waits. They did not know what they were doing. They did not know that the hand they had just cuffed was the hand that had signed orders to convict the corrupt, protect the weak, and uphold justice. They did not know that the man they were humiliating had the power to decide the fate of thousands of people, including abusers like themselves. When his identity was revealed, and it would come sooner or later, what would happen to their pride? To the belated apologies? And to whom would justice choose to stand? This is not just the story of a man wronged. It is a lesson in prejudice, how it can cloud reason, crush honor, and obscure justice. That day, at the Denver airport, the truth was handcuffed. But it would not be subdued. The baggage claim and exits of the Denver airport kept a steady rhythm, sometimes slow, sometimes hurried, as if it were trying to catch up with the world outside. A tall man walked through the crowd, unhurried, unobtrusive. He made no effort to draw attention, there was no need. His neatness in his dress, his straight back, and his quiet, authoritative gaze were enough to make people turn to look. Federal Judge Arthur Sterling was not a man who would easily blend into a crowd. But today, all he wanted was to return to his familiar office corner, where the black and white files did not judge him, or to his family, where he was loved unconditionally, without judgment. After a long day of handling grueling cases, where justice was sometimes a double-edged sword, he craved quiet. At the same time, in a less frequented corner of the arrivals hall, 2 security officers were standing guard as usual. Vincent Rossi, a white man in his 50s, leaned against the wall, his arms crossed over his chest, his eyes dull but not lacking in sharpness. His face bore the accumulated fatigue of decades of work, but also a scowl as if the world owed him something. His eyes were filled with skepticism, and sometimes, contempt. Next to Rossi, Dale Harding, a young officer new to the job, was still energetic and alert in every movement. He stood straight, his eyes scanning each passenger as if trying to prove himself. Suddenly, a soft beep sounded from the tablet mounted on the nearby patrol car. Dale bent down, pressing open the new notification from the security dispatch system. Rossi glanced over as well. Security alert, arrival gate B32. Suspect, male, black, dark suit. Suspected of carrying controlled substances. Based on unidentified passenger analysis and preliminary intelligence. Increase patrols, appropriate checks if found. Rossi raised an eyebrow. The alert was, as usual, vague, unsubstantiated, just a series of half-truths analyzed by the system from behavior and appearance. A controversial mechanism. And Rossi, despite being a protester on paper, always felt it made sense. He raised his head, his razor-sharp gaze scanning the crowd of people moving toward the exit. Then, as if by old instinct, his gaze stopped. Arthur Sterling. A charcoal trench coat, white shirt, and neat tie, fitting the sketchy description perfectly. But it wasn't just the physical match that caught Rossi's attention, it was something else. The skin. A cold, almost venomous smile flickered across Rossi's lips. His prejudices, which had been ingrained in his blood over the years, were immediately resurrected. A successful, well-mannered black man. There was no way he wasn't suspicious. In Rossi's eyes, their success always needed to be tested. He didn't know, or didn't want to know, that he was looking at a federal judge, a man who had spent his life upholding the law and justice. But right now, Arthur Sterling was just a potential suspect, because he was black and looked so neat. There was something fishy behind Rossi's gaze. The security briefing, vague and unconfirmed, was the perfect excuse, a pass given to him and Harding to approach and check out the man who had made Rossi uneasy from the first time he saw him. "Hey, Dale," Rossi said, nudging Harding with his elbow, a hint of amusement in his voice. "That guy seems to fit the description." Rossi pointed with his eyes, and Harding followed. It was Judge Sterling. The man was in a sharp suit, his bearing almost provocative. "It's not unusual," Rossi continued, "for someone who's so well-dressed to have something to hide. Drugs, for example." Harding hesitated. He looked at Sterling, then at Rossi, his experienced, prejudiced superior. Harding knew something was wrong. But the line between professional doubt and personal prejudice is often blurry. "Yes, sir," Harding said, almost reluctantly. "It seems worth checking." The two men broke away from the crowd and walked briskly toward Judge Sterling. They acted like professional officers, but the way Rossi walked, firm, self-satisfied, made Harding feel like he was participating in a staged scene. Sterling stood there, tall, unruffled. He was walking toward the security gate when the two officers stopped him rather abruptly. "Sir," Rossi said, his voice stern but with a hint of a condescending smile, "we are airport police. There is a security alert regarding drugs. Your description fits your appearance." Under the cold white light, Judge Sterling's face was slightly pinched. But he was not angry. Not afraid. Just a slight surprise, and then he regained his characteristic composure. "A security alert?" Sterling repeated, his voice low and smooth. "Drug possession? Can you provide more information? I want to know on what basis I am suspected." He didn't seem worried. He just wanted things done according to the law. The way a federal judge knew better than anyone. His calm, especially his dark skin, seemed to irritate Rossi more than reassure him. He was used to people being scared, embarrassed, or at least apologetic when stopped by the police. But Sterling was different, and that difference revealed a rift in Rossi's belief in security alerts. Harding was silent. In his mind at this moment, there was a question that kept revolving. Is this a legitimate mission, or just an excuse to satisfy the hidden prejudice of his superiors? International Airport, Domestic Security. "Sir Security," Judge Arthur Sterling's voice rang out, calm but not hiding the confusion and irritation that was creeping in. "I think there's been some sort of mistake." "This is a routine check," Rossi, the security officer with the dark glasses and stony face, replied without the slightest wavering. However, he leaned forward, his eyes as sharp as knives slicing through the air. "We need to verify the information recorded in the system. Please show me your identification." Arthur Sterling frowned slightly. He was no stranger to these kinds of encounters, where the title, federal judge, suddenly became meaningless against his brown skin and the prejudiced gazes of others. Although he found the situation almost comical, he slowly opened his black leather briefcase, took out his wallet, and pulled out his driver's license. Here are my papers, he said, handing them to Rossi, but his eyes never left his face. And I want to know more specifically about the basis of your suspicion. Rossi took them, glanced quickly at the information, and stopped at the name, Arthur Sterling. His eyes slid down to the address, an affluent neighborhood on the west side of town. He snorted. Arthur Sterling, Rossi repeated, almost savoring the name as if tasting some strange food he didn't like. That suit must be worth a few $1,000s, huh? He sneered. What kind of business are you in that you're flagged for drugs? Or is this just a nice cover? The question had lost its usual tone of interrogation. It had become a personal attack, sharp and vicious. Rossi didn't need a reason, he was trying to provoke a reaction, deliberately focusing on the man's appearance, his success, his pride. Officer Harding, standing nearby, saw that the situation was getting out of hand, and interjected in a more gentle tone, "Yes, you are not like the usual suspects we encounter, but the alert system is automatic. There may be a mistake, but we have to check. It's just procedure." Arthur Sterling looked from one to the other. He didn't need anyone to explain, it was all too obvious. Any excuses were a thin layer of paint to cover up the truth, he was being treated differently because of the color of his skin. And anger rose in his chest, like a tide rising on a full moon, fierce and insidious. But his voice remained calm, even colder than before. "Officers," he said, each word as clearly as if he were reading a verdict, "I realize this interrogation has completely strayed from its original purpose. The comments about my dress, about my profession, it is no longer a security check. It is prejudice." The air in the interrogation room seemed to freeze. The air in the room suddenly felt heavy, as if a storm were brewing. Judge Sterling sensed something was wrong the moment Rossi entered, his cold gaze piercing his very being. This was no ordinary examination, no, this was an attack on his very being. When Sterling questioned the procedure and demanded to know the specific reason for their presence, Rossi growled. "Who do you think you are to be here? A man like you should be reasonable and cooperative." The words, cold, venomous, and suggestive, seemed to touch a sensitive nerve in the judge. Rossi hated being questioned, and he hated being contradicted by someone like Sterling, a black man, educated, and high in the legal system. For Rossi, that was unacceptable. His face was red with anger, his eyes were like a provoked beast. "Discrimination," he shouted, each word emphasizing. "You're being rude. You're the one in question here. Don't act like you know the law better than me." The contempt was evident on his face. "I hate you upstarts, always acting all high and mighty and looking down on others." At this point, things seemed to spiral out of control. Rossi could no longer maintain his thin veneer of professionalism. He let out blatant racist remarks, swearing non-stop, as if he had been waiting for this opportunity to reveal his true nature. Harding, who had been accompanying him, had initially maintained his composure, and began to waver as he saw his comrade losing control. But when Rossi took a step forward, pointed his finger straight at Sterling and growled, "Shut up and cooperate, or you'll see me," Sterling understood that any argument was meaningless now. "This conversation has crossed the line of professionalism," Sterling said, his voice calm but his eyes burning. "I demand to speak to your supervisor, immediately." The request was, to Rossi, a final insult, an attack on his powerful, proud ego. "Oh, now you dare call the boss," he roared, his rage turning into action. "Who do you think you are to oppose a law enforcement officer? I suspect you of smuggling. Dale, handcuff him. Search the place." Harding hesitated, his eyes glancing at Sterling, who was still standing upright, his gaze unwavering. Despite the tension, Sterling remained unusually calm. That made Harding reluctantly follow Rossi's orders, perhaps out of fear, or perhaps out of habit. Rossi lunged forward, attempting to grab Sterling's arm. "What are you doing?" Sterling snapped, trying to avoid contact. "This is an illegal arrest. You have no right." In that chaotic moment, as Harding reached out toward him, Sterling jerked back in self-defense, and his hand unconsciously hit Harding. That act of defense, like a last spark, was instantly distorted, stifled by the system he had once believed in. In the crowded airport, where farewells and reunions often resound, a chaotic and suffocating scene was gradually forming. "See him resisting!" Rossi shouted, his voice full of excitement and a bit of satisfaction. He rushed forward, as if enjoying the moment of legitimizing his intervention. Harding, another officer, did not delay, jumping in as if he were arresting a dangerous terrorist. Amidst the astonished eyes of the crowd, two burly officers struggled with an elderly man, but still tried to maintain their posture, not letting themselves collapse. Judge Arthur Sterling, in his solemn gray suit, a symbol of justice and dignity, still resisted, not to escape, but to retain the last bit of dignity. "I did nothing wrong," he growled, his eyes fixed on Rossi, no fear, just a dull pain that was quietly rising. But it all happened too quickly. The heavy breathing, the sound of shoes sliding on the floor, the screams, and then, click, the cold sound of handcuffs rang out, like an invisible sentence on the person who once represented the law. His arms were twisted behind him, his wrinkled skin was tightly gripped by metal, his wrists were sore and numb, but what made him tremble was not the physical pain, but the absolute humiliation. Being treated like a criminal in public, the horrified and pitiful eyes of the surrounding passengers deepened the hurt. Some took out their phones, recording the scene. They knew nothing about him, only saw an old, black man in a wrinkled suit being handcuffed. No one saw the symbol of justice being crushed under the boots of those empowered to protect it. Rossi stood there, panting, sweat beading on his forehead, but his lips curled into a twisted smile. "See," he spat out each word like a bombardment. "I told you. Think you're so cool with your nice suit? Go to the station and see if you can still pretend to be a judge." The word "pretend" fell like a slap. It not only tarnished the title, but also denied Sterling as a person, all the years of dedication, all the fair judgments, all now twisted into a stain. Sterling closed his eyes for a moment, swallowing the bitter taste of injustice. He wanted to scream, to tell everyone that he was not a criminal, how wrong this was. But he knew, at this moment, any words would only make them tighten the handcuffs. The storm was not over. And he, though wounded, was still standing. Two officers dragged him away, past curious, fearful, and indifferent looks. Some smacked their lips, some looked away, some shook their heads silently. No one intervened. Rossi, as if that were not enough, pulled out a small notebook, pen tip ready to write down what would become the report. Not the truth, but a version of the truth, written by the victor. Judge Sterling's arm was pulled back roughly. Harding's fingers tightened around him as if he were holding a dangerous criminal. Harding's voice rang out, arrogant, commanding, without a trace of respect. "Talk." He almost hissed the words, his eyes filled with self-imposed authority. Sterling took a deep breath. Though his cuffed wrists throbbed with pain, and his pride was cut to the core, he raised his head. His voice rang out, calm, decisive, no trace of panic or fear, despite the chaos of Arthur's airport surrounding them. "Full name," Harding said, his voice cracking. Sterling didn't answer right away. He glanced at Rossi, who was scribbling in a notebook, still staring at him with the arrogance of someone who thought he was in control. "Sterling," he said, slowly. "Sterling Rossi." Rossi looked up, half smiling. "Sterling sounds fancy," he said, sneering. "What are you doing dressed like that? A king? Some kind of business judge?" Sterling looked Rossi straight in the eye. No avoidance. No condescension. His gaze hardened, not with anger, but because the truth he was about to speak needed weight. Not to save himself from this humiliating situation, but to make one thing clear, the people holding him captive would pay. "I am a federal judge." He paused, a beat, letting the words resonate like a gavel on the courtroom table. Then he continued, slowly, as if he were reading a final verdict. The Federal Court of Appeals, 10th Circuit. A dead silence immediately filled the small space where they stood. The airport loudspeakers, the rolling of luggage wheels, all seemed to recede from their world in that moment. Only the ringing of the bell remained in Rossi's ears, and his heartbeat seemed to stop. Rossi stood frozen. His face paled, the arrogant red of a moment ago gone, replaced by a sheet of paper. The pen slipped from his hand, falling to the cold tile floor, making a sharp clinking sound like an accusation. His eyes widened, round with shock. He stared at Sterling as if he couldn't believe what he had just heard. His mouth opened, wanting to say something, but only meaningless sounds came out, stuck in his throat. Judge, Judge. Finally, he managed to utter a word, his voice breaking like glass against stone. Federation. No. No way. District. District 10. Rossi took a step back, staggering as if he had been punched in the chest. There was no longer any pride on his face, only fear, regret, and panic that was rising like a tidal wave. He took a step back, his eyes wide with horror, as if he had just encountered a ghost from hell. When he saw Judge Sterling, his entire body froze, as if his soul had been drained by an undeniable truth. Dale Harding, the young cop, reacted even more violently when the name, Federal Judge Sterling, was uttered. His face paled, all the color drained from his body like the blood drained from his body. The hands that had been so roughly gripping the judge now dropped abruptly, as if they had just realized they were holding something too sacred, or too dangerous. He turned to look at Sterling, then glanced at Rossi. His eyes were panicked, desperate, pleading, like a child caught in the act of a serious crime. The man they had thrown to the ground less than 5 minutes ago was now holding his head high, without a word enough to push them both over the edge. Oh no. It can't be, Harding whispered, his voice shaking as if he were about to cry. His legs went weak, his knees began to shake. The change in demeanor from arrogant, belligerent to utterly terrified was so quick, so obvious, that even those standing nearby could feel the sudden chill that swept through them. None of them knew exactly what was happening, but they could feel it. The previous arrogant confidence had completely evaporated, replaced by a primal fear, the fear of paying the price for touching someone they absolutely shouldn't have touched. Rossi was the first to break free from his panic. In his mind, the prospect of losing his job, being sued, even going to jail flashed through him like a nightmare in broad daylight. He rushed in front of Judge Sterling, his head almost bowed to the ground, his eyes filled with regret, despair, and pleading. Your Honor. God, forgive me, Rossi stammered, his face white, sweat pouring down his temples as if he had just emerged from a crematorium. This is just a terrible mistake, our fault. We really don't know who you are. He turned sharply to Harding, who was still frozen as stone, and shouted in a choked panic. Harding. You idiot. What are you doing standing there? Take off the handcuffs. He's a federal judge, quick. Do you want us both dead? Harding was startled as if struck by lightning, and staggered to his feet. He frantically pulled the keys from his belt, but his hands shook so much that they clattered to the floor. No one said anything. The atmosphere was tense. He quickly bent down, his hands trembling as he groped on the cold ground, trying to pick up each key. His face was blank and panicked. And in those 10 seconds, time seemed to stand still, leaving behind a pounding heart and guilt creeping into every breath. Before he finally inserted the key into the lock, the air seemed to freeze. There was a dry click, not just the sound of the handcuffs being released, but an invisible boundary being broken. The handcuffs came off, freeing Judge Arthur Sterling, and also revealing deep scars on his wrists, wounds not just from the metal but from the painful insult to his dignity. Rossi was still speaking, or rather, pleading, his voice choked, trembling, filled with tears and remorse. We're so sorry, sir. It's just, the security brief wasn't clear. We were just trying to do the right thing, maybe we were, too much, please forgive us, don't ruin our careers, we have families, we have children to support. Sterling didn't respond. He slowly raised both hands, gently rubbing his wrists, where the flesh was red and swollen. No words. No nods. No anger. No forgiveness. He just stood there. Silent. Standing like a cold stone. His deep, unblinking eyes fixed on the two men trembling before him, a look that needed no condemnation but was enough to break a man. That silence was more terrible than an accusation. That moment, the silence of a federal judge, was as reverberating as a verdict without being pronounced. It said that justice, however delayed by prejudice, by the haste of human folly, would come. With a grim calm, like the thick air in the room now, filled with the panic of Rossi and Harding, and the cold calm of Judge Sterling. A female voice, clear and professional, cut through the tension. What's going on here? Lieutenant Eva Rostova had just entered the area, walking quickly and neatly. She was a middle-aged woman, her uniform was pressed, her hair tied back neatly at the nape of her neck. Her face was stern, but her eyes were as sharp as a scalpel, scanning the scene quickly. She needed only one look to know that this was no ordinary mistake. Standing straight, despite his rumpled suit and red wrists, Arthur Sterling still exuded an unmistakable aura. The way he looked straight into her eyes, calm, proud, as if he didn't need to reveal his identity. Rossi and Harding, her two subordinates, were now almost broken. Their faces were pale, wet with sweat. They didn't dare look up. Perhaps Rostova had recognized who he was, or at least sensed the magnitude and gravity of the situation. Something was wrong. Very wrong. And she knew, what she did next, or didn't do, would change everything. Report, Rossi Harding. Lieutenant Rotova's voice rang out like a sharp knife cutting through the tense atmosphere. She deliberately kept her voice unwavering, not revealing any emotion towards the two subordinates standing before her, or rather, trembling as they tried to stand up straight. Harding flinched, startled as if he had just been slapped without warning. He tried to straighten his posture, but his shoulders still trembled slightly under the stern gaze of his superior. Beside him, Rossi, the older one, was so flustered that he almost lost control of his words. His voice tried to sound calm, but it was filled with fear and disappointment, as if he himself did not believe what he was saying. We think, the system notification was unclear, and perhaps, there may have been a misunderstanding in the identity verification process, he stammered, his eyes looking down at the ground as if avoiding the responsibility that was weighing on him. But Rotova was unmoved. Her brows were furrowed, her eyes filled with suspicion and impatience. She did not say a word to the other two, but instead turned to the special guest who had just been dragged into this unacceptable situation, Judge Sterling. She straightened her back, her voice changing to a respectful but firm tone. Sir, I am Lieutenant Rotova, in charge of this area. I sincerely apologize for what happened. May I ask what happened from your perspective? Judge Sterling was silent for a moment, then spoke. His voice was low, calm, and devoid of any agitation, as if he were standing on the stand, recounting the facts objectively, without adding or subtracting. I was detained on a vague notice of an interview, he said. They asked me pointless questions, clearly biased based on my appearance and race. I was denied the right to speak to my superiors, subjected to unnecessary force, and then unlawfully detained in handcuffs. He didn't need to repeat his name, the title of Federal Judge Sterling was a statement in itself. Rotova didn't say anything right away. But her eyes changed, becoming sharper, colder. It was clear that she knew, or at least sensed, the gravity of her subordinates' actions. She turned to look at Rossi and Harding, her gaze no longer filled with suspicion, but with disappointment and anger. Rossi. Harding. She said their names slowly, as if punishing them for each word. Turn in your badges, weapons, and radios. Immediately. You are both suspended indefinitely, pending the outcome of the investigation. Stand back. Do not speak again without further instructions. The air was heavy with cold. Rossi and Harding could only stammer, yes, in shame and confusion, like two children caught in the act. They had not only made a mistake in their mission, they had crossed the thin line between power and abuse, and now they had to face the consequences. Their futures, Rossi and Harding, were sealed in that moment. Not by handcuffs, but by the unforgiving gaze of truth. Lieutenant Rostova stood tall, her gaze as hard as stone, facing Judge Sterling. The respect in her stance was palpable, but also tense. Sterling, her uniform still stained with airport dust and faint red marks on her wrists, regarded her calmly, proudly, but wearily. Her expression was a mixture of pent-up pain and unyielding fortitude. Judge Sterling, Rostova said, her voice solemn but not cold, on behalf of the entire Denver Airport Police Force, I offer you my deepest and most sincere apologies. Sterling nodded, his eyes never leaving her. We accept full responsibility for the unacceptable and disgraceful conduct of these officers. This is not only a violation of your dignity, but also a betrayal of the core principles and ethics of our profession that we are sworn to uphold. She paused, took a deep breath as if to gather her resolve, and continued. We are committed to conducting a completely transparent internal investigation. There is no room for cover-ups. There is no room for leniency. Their actions not only dishonor the honor of the force, but also confront us with the most serious question of all, who are we protecting? Sterling narrowed her eyes slightly, her voice low and clear, I do not require medical attention. The scars will heal. But what happened must be made public. I want to make an official statement about the whole incident. We will arrange it immediately, Rostova replied, bowing her head. You will be taken to a more private, safe, and comfortable place. Sterling nodded. Before leaving, she turned slowly, looking at the two officers who stood bowed like ghosts in the cold fluorescent light of the headquarters. I request that all video and audio from Rossi and Harding's police cameras be preserved in their original state, unaltered. They will be irrefutable evidence. The request has been noted and will certainly be carried out, ma'am, Rostova confirmed. Those tapes will be the heart of the investigation. She signaled for an officer to escort Judge Sterling out of the room. Before she left, Sterling glanced back one last time. Rossi and Harding were still standing there, heads bowed, faces strangled by unspeakable humiliation. Neither of them dared to look up. There was nothing left to hold on to. There was no one left to defend. They were buried alive in their own stupidity. Their futures as law enforcement officers are now mere shadows, staggering in the face of a verdict. They have committed crimes that they can blame no one but themselves. Justice may be slow, but it is not blind. The case of a federal judge wrongfully arrested and mistreated by airport police because of the color of his skin has quickly ignited a fire of outrage throughout Denver. And the storm is just beginning. An internal investigation was launched shortly after the shocking incident at Denver International Airport. Under strict supervision from above, and with special attention from federal agencies, as Judge Arthur Sterling himself had requested, all evidence was thoroughly reviewed, especially the body camera footage of officers Vincent Rossi and Dale Harding. When the footage was released, the truth could no longer be hidden. It was not just a professional error, it was a clear, naked demonstration of the abuse of power and deep-seated biases that some people in uniform are guilty of. The footage exposed how Rossi relied on a vague security message, transmitted over the system, to justify stopping and searching a black passenger, without any specific indication of suspicion. His voice is heard on camera, full of prejudice, not only asking biased questions, but also going further with insults, contempt, and escalating violence. When the victim, in panic and desperation, tries to explain, plead, all his words are ignored. It is not until his true identity is confirmed, a respected figure in society, that everything stops, but it is too late. The scene becomes a silent indictment of unprofessionalism, abuse of power, and racism, things that society has been trying to eradicate every day. At the same time, the original security announcement, the one that sparked the tragedy, is also reviewed. The results show that it was issued based on unverified, weak intelligence and had no basis for such drastic action. This further reinforced the view that Rossi and Harding had used the announcement to satisfy their personal prejudices. Under undeniable pressure from the media, the community, and even within the department, the investigation concluded, Officer Vincent Rossi and Officer Dale Harding had committed serious violations of professional regulations, including using inappropriate language, abusing power, discriminating, and detaining people without due process. The punishment was delivered without delay. Both were fired from the Denver Airport Police Department. Rossi's decades-long career, once considered a veteran, and Harding's budding future, were both shattered by a few minutes of blind action, stemming from arrogance and bias. The incident may also lead to civil lawsuits, notably from Judge Arthur Sterling, who has been deeply traumatized by the very injustice he has fought against all his life. A few days later, in the quiet office of the federal courthouse, the afternoon light filtered through the blinds, gilding the old wooden desk. Judge Arthur Sterling sat quietly, his eyes fixed on the window. He was used to handing down sentences. But today, his heart was not on the scales of justice, but on his personal trauma, both as a man unjustly targeted because of the color of his skin, and as a man who saw the system he served being corrupted by those unworthy to wear its uniform. But he knew, justice is not perfect. It is a journey, sometimes tearful and bitter, for the truth to be known, and for those who have abused their power to be held accountable. And today, in a small corner of history, justice spoke. The afternoon light streamed through the large windows, illuminating the thick stacks of files, illuminating not only the dry words but also the unspoken feelings. The room was the same, quiet, orderly, but his heart was not the same. He was back. Back at his desk, back to his daily routine, making coffee, opening files, reading each page of the law, but the aftershocks of the airport incident still weighed heavily on his mind. The lingering fear, the simmering anger, and the hurt, all of it blended together in a complex mix of emotions that were hard to name. He was relieved that the matter had been settled. The wrongdoers had been held accountable. Justice, at least in his case, had been served quickly. But deep down, there was a lingering sadness, a disappointment that would not be easily dispelled. As a man who had spent his life in the service of the law, he understood better than anyone the fragility of justice. A man who sat on a high bench defending what was right, now suddenly realized that he could also become a victim of the very prejudices and injustices he had worked so hard to eradicate. He knew that if he had not been federal Judge Arthur Sterling that day, if he had just been Arthur, a black man in a suit, a lawyer, a businessman, or simply an ordinary citizen, the story might have been different. Very different. He might have been taken to the police station. Searched. Humiliated. Falsely accused. And forced into a long legal battle to regain his honor. The judgeship had inadvertently become a shield, but also a mirror reflecting a bitter truth, that justice still does not come to everyone equally. In his case, justice had come quickly, but was it true for everyone? The question still haunted him. He stood up and walked to the window. His eyes followed the bustling crowd below, where the incident had taken place. Although painful, the memory was a powerful reminder of the responsibility he bore, a judge who must not only pass judgment but also steadfastly uphold justice. He understood that for the law to be truly meaningful, it must be applied equally to all, regardless of race, status, or circumstances. As an African American who had experienced discrimination, he felt it was his duty to speak up, to act, to change perceptions, to break down prejudices, and to gradually build a truly just society. He returned to his desk. He picked up a file. His eyes shone with determination. There was still so much work to be done. The fight against injustice was long. But he will not back down. Because he believes in justice. And he knows, no matter how bumpy the road, it is worth taking.